First article. This article asks two main questions. Are the concepts of space, time, and matter influenced by language? And are there any links between cultural, behavioral norms, and linguistic patterns? To answer the first question, Sapir looked at the speakers of Hopi. Hopi is an event-based language with no mass nouns, lacks standard tenses, duration words, habitual thought, and behavior. Sapir cites this as evidence that time and space are not perceived equally by all, but is instead perceived through the lens of language. This is furthered into the premise that certain concepts, or in other words, thoughts, can only be formed by speaking certain languages. For the second question, Sapir says there are connections but not correlations between culture and language. He draws the conclusion that the absence of certain qualities like tenses doesn't automatically mean that there are certain cultural aspects disappear. Instead, the link is far more tenuous, but a link does exist between culture and the system of thought. Second article. This article proposes the idea that language influences the perceived reality. Quoting Slevin directly. Each one is a subjective orientation to the world of human experiences, and this orientation affects the ways in which we think while we are speaking. Slobin gathers experimental data by asking multilingual volunteers to describe the relative positions and movements of objects. He identified difference between different language speakers. English speakers are interested in event progression, while Germans elaborate on the trajectories of objects, while Hebrew speakers are indifferent to either. He further proposes that childhood languages affect how we perceive events, and they stick into adulthood and do not change even when we are learning or speaking a second language. This thinking is in line with Wobb's hypothesis on language and thought, and Slobin experimentally shows the influence of language on time, space, and movement. Article 3. This paper examines the question, does speaking a language without number words change the way the speakers of that language experience exact quantities? And it does this by studying the Pirha people, an Amazonian tribe with limited vocabulary for numerals, with the words for only one or many. This article concluded that, and quoting directly here, a total lack of exact quantity language did not prevent the Pirha from accurately performing a task which relied on exact numerical equivalents of large sets. In other words, the limited numerical vocabularies do not alter the underlying cognitive and perceptual capabilities of speakers. This paper proposes that language just adds a preferred route for encoding and processing information. The implication of this hypothesis is that language affects certain thought processes in distinct ways. Thus, this paper supports the weak interpretation of the Woffian claim. Article 4. In this article, Cohen studies the impact of using Portuguese and French on emotions with a bilingual speaker, Linda. Quoting directly, Linda experiences herself, and her evaluators experience her as an angrier, more forceful, and more aggressive in French. The author believes that semantics like grammar and vocab alone do not account for the differences in how Linda experiences emotion in different languages. She, after studying the specific linguistic patterns, word choices, and tone of Linda, along with other variables, proposes that there actually exists a social linguistic culture between biculturalism and bilingualism. In other words, people can express the same emotions differently based on what language they are speaking. Consequently, we can also say that the emotions experienced are also affected by the language you're speaking. This paper offers evidence that languages offer differing ways to encode information, but not necessarily change the fundamental piece of information. In other words, a person may be more angry in one language over another, but they are fundamentally angry in both languages. Fifth paper. This article explores the relationship between gender and mental model of nouns. Languages like Spanish and German assign genders to some or all nouns. According to the Wigg-Woffian hypothesis, the gender of the objects of language learned in childhood affects the attributes we attach to those inanimate objects. Experiments on German and Spanish speakers conducted by the authors found that speakers recall the proper names for these different objects better if they lined up with the gender of the object as they learned them. In other words, Germans remembered Patrick the apple more than Patricia the apple, while Spanish speakers did the opposite. It is interesting to note that the gender for apple in German is male, while in Spanish is female. The authors hypothesize the reason behind this is that people routinely categorize objects when memorizing and recalling them. And quoting directly, the linguistic categories can influence people's thinking by encouraging them to carry out comparisons that they wouldn't have otherwise carried out. Thus, the grammatical and gender distinctions of a language can influence and bias people's memory. This work generally supports Slobin's hypothesis. Article 6. This work was done in response to Berlin and Kay's work on color. Lucy focuses on the shortcomings in the research methodology. His first major criticism: in his attempt to probe the semantics of the language, attention to linguistic structure is virtually lacking, meaning the lack of linguistic knowledge of the researchers meant that they applied their pre-existing biases and knowledge to the analysis, causing the analysis to be flawed. His second argument against Berlin and Kay is that they viewed colors as adjectives used to describe only the appearances accurately, a holdover from the English language. Finally, he describes the Wolffian notions of Berlin and Kay as inevitable, as the research procedure essentially pre-proposes this common reality at every interpretive juncture. This radical realism yields a radical universalism. He opposes Wolffian's idea, at least for color. Quoting directly, the contrast with the color term tradition, which focuses on whether the visual neurophysiology has any effect on those lexical terms referring to visual appearances. In other words, color is a perceptual interpretation of light. Thus, for now at least, Lucy is against the Wolffian notions of language for color. Paper 7. This paper deals with whether the words used to depict colors affect the perceived reality and thoughts. It is conducted on experiments with Greek, German, and Russian speakers using nonverbal cues, EEG machines, and an attentional blink paradigm to reduce any human biases in the experiment. They found that Greek speakers with specific terms for light and dark blue were able to distinguish these two shades of blue faster than two similarly distinct shades of green. German speakers, acting as control, took similar time to identify the blue and green shades. Russian speakers will also make a linguistic distinction between blue. Similar to the Greeks, were able to identify the blue shades faster than the shades of green. This leads to the conclusion that the language we speak affects our thoughts, as quoting directly, our native language and the color categories we apply within it can influence whether we consciously perceive a stimulus or not. This paper provides experimental support to Wolff's hypothesis that there exist links between linguistic patterns and the concepts of space and aspect. Paper 8. This article looks at the connection between languages and directions. It studies the language Google Meter and how directions in it are presented and compares it to other languages like English. Guy defines two different coordinate systems, egocentric and geocentric. Egocentric coordinates revolve around the speaker, whereas geocentric systems align themselves with the cardinal directions. So east remains east regardless of whichever direction the speaker is facing. In this chapter, the author showed how this sense of direction remains consistent even when recalling events. A man said he jumped west when facing north, and days later, recalling the same event, he said he jumped east when facing south. Thus, the cardinal direction and the recollection of the events remain spatially consistent. This leads to the question, do speakers of two different languages see spaces differently? This chapter, and Guy says yes, and quoting directly, you will see and remember the same room twice, whereas a Google Meter speaker will see and remember two different rooms. Thus, according to Guy, at least in terms of spatiality, there exists a connection between the language you speak and the concepts of space, time, and spatiality.